Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones people can see, but the ones we carry in our hearts about not being enough. Abigail Turner knew that feeling well as she stepped off the stagecoach in Montana Territory, believing no man would ever truly want a woman like her. At 26, she was considered damaged goods. Her broken engagement back east had left her with whispers following her everywhere about being barren. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger through a mail-order arrangement, convinced it was her last chance at having a family. Then she met Thaddeus Big Jack Calloway. This mountain man was built like a fortress, with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to look right through her pretenses. When he spoke, his words weren't flowery promises. Instead, he asked her one simple question that would change everything. What happens when a woman who thinks she's worthless meets a man who sees her as the answer to his prayers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust of Silver Creek, Montana Territory, clung to Abigail. Turner's dark blue traveling dress like a persistent memory she couldn't shake. She stood beside the wooden platform, her worn carpetbag heavy in her gloved hands, watching the stagecoach disappear into the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the small frontier town. The September air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, so different from the familiar smells of Boston's crowded streets and her family's bakery. Her reflection in the general store window showed a woman who had learned to make herself small. Brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, grey eyes that had lost their sparkle somewhere between her 21st birthday and the day Charles Whitmore walked out of her life. She wore no jewelry except for her mother's simple silver locket, the one piece of beauty she had allowed herself to keep. The journey west had taken 3 weeks. 3 weeks of rattling coaches, questionable lodgings, and the constant weight of other passengers' curious stares when they learned she was traveling alone to marry a man she'd never met. Their whispered conversations had followed her from depot to depot. Poor thing, must be desperate. At her age, what choice does she have? Mail-order brides. What's this world coming to? Abigail had heard worse back home. Charles Whitmore had been everything Boston society deemed suitable for a merchant's daughter. Handsome, educated, from a good family with shipping interests that complemented her father's flower business. Their engagement had been announced with great fanfare in the society pages, complete with detailed descriptions of her trousseau and the elaborate wedding her mother had planned. For 8 months, she'd believed herself the luckiest woman in Massachusetts. Charles was attentive, bringing her flowers and books of poetry. He'd spoken of their future children with such tenderness, describing the nursery they'd create in his family's Beacon Hill mansion. She'd spent hours embroidering tiny gowns and knitting soft blankets, her heart full of maternal dreams. The first hint of trouble came when her monthly courses continued without interruption, month after month. Her mother had taken her to Dr. Pemberton, who'd performed uncomfortable examinations and asked intrusive questions about her family history. When the verdict came, a tilted womb that would likely prevent conception, Abigail's world began to crumble. Charles had been understanding at first. "We'll keep trying, my dear," he'd said, holding her while she wept. "Perhaps the doctor is wrong." But as seasons passed without the hoped-for announcement, his ardor cooled. Social events became strained affairs, where Abigail felt the pitying glances of other young wives who displayed their growing bellies like badges of successful womanhood. The end came on a cold February morning. Charles had arrived at her father's house with his hat in his hands and regret in his eyes. "Abigail, you know I care for you deeply," he'd begun, the words every woman dreads hearing. "But I must consider my family's expectations. My father needs an heir for the business, and we both know this arrangement isn't working as we'd hoped." He'd been kind about it, as kind as a man could be while crushing a woman's dreams. No public scandal, no harsh words, Just a quiet dissolution that left Abigail feeling like defective merchandise returned to the shelf. The months that followed were a blur of well-meaning relatives and whispered family conferences. Her sister Elizabeth had married successfully and produced 2 healthy sons, making Abigail's failure all the more pronounced. Sunday dinners became exercises in avoiding eye contact, family gatherings where her unmarried status hung over the table like a funeral shroud. It was her Aunt Catherine who'd first mentioned the mail-order bride advertisements in the Western newspapers. Practical arrangements, she'd called them, showing Abigail the neat columns of hopeful bachelors seeking wives. These frontier men need partners, not just pretty ornaments. Hard work and loyalty matter more than other considerations. The advertisement that caught Abigail's attention was simple compared to others. No flowery language or promises of easy living. Just T. Calloway, mountain homestead near Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Seeking practical woman for marriage and partnership. Must be strong, willing to work, and desire family life. Send letter with particulars. She'd written 3 drafts before sending her response, each one more honest than the last. She'd told him about her age, her broken engagement, and Dr. Pemberton's diagnosis. If he was to reject her, better it happen by mail than face-to-face. His reply had been equally direct. Miss Turner, your honesty is appreciated. If you're willing to work hard and build something together, I'll meet the next stagecoach. Practical arrangements suit me fine. T. Calloway. Now, standing in the Montana dust, with that letter tucked in her reticule, Abigail wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Silver Creek was smaller than she'd imagined, a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church with a modest steeple, and perhaps 24 houses scattered around the settlement. Mountains rose like sentinels in every direction, their peaks already touched with early snow that promised a harsh winter ahead. You'd be Miss Turner, I expect. The voice was deep, steady, and came from directly behind her. Abigail turned, her breath catching as she looked up and up at the man approaching her. Thaddeus Calloway stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained his worn flannel shirt and hands that looked capable of splitting logs with their bare strength. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, touched with silver at the temples, and his face was weathered by years of mountain, sun, and wind. But it was his eyes that made her stomach flutter with something that might have been fear or might have been something else entirely. Dark brown, almost black, they held an intensity that seemed to see straight through her careful composure to the frightened woman beneath. "Mr. Calloway," she managed, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'm Abigail Turner." He nodded once, a gesture that conveyed acknowledgement without judgment. "Call me Thaddius, or Big Jack, like most folks do." He gestured toward her carpetbag. "That all you brought?" "Yes, sir, I didn't want to presume." "No presuming needed. You came. That's what matters." He lifted her bag as if it weighed nothing, which made Abigail acutely aware of how little she truly owned. Everything that mattered to her fit in one worn piece of luggage. They walked toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 massive draft horses. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with the weight of 2 strangers trying to measure each other's worth. "Town's small," Thaddeus said as he helped her onto the wagon seat. His hands were gentle despite their size, calloused but clean. "But folks are decent. Dr. Morrison delivered most of the young ones you'll see running about. Martha Henderson runs the general store with her husband Pete. She'll help you with whatever you need for settling in." "How far is your, Abigail stumbled over the pronoun. "The homestead's about 8 miles up into the foothills. Good land, sheltered valley. House is solid, built it myself 5 years back." He settled beside her on the seat, the wagon, dipping slightly under his weight. "Stream runs year-round, good for water and fishing. Garden spot gets morning sun." As they left the town behind, Abigail found herself studying his profile. There was something solid about him, like the mountains themselves. Not handsome in the refined way Charles had been, but compelling in a completely different manner. When he spoke about his land, his voice carried a quiet pride that spoke of a man who'd built something with his own hands. "Been alone out there. Long?" she asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. 5 years, he said without apparent offense. "Built the place thinking I'd find a wife eventually. Time kept passing." He glanced at her. "Not much call for social events where I live. Town dances happen maybe twice a year, and the available women, well, most of them are young enough to be my daughters or already spoken for. How old are you?" 38 come November. "You?" 26 last month. He nodded as if that settled something in his mind. Good age for a woman, old enough to know her mind, young enough to... He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. Young enough to what? Abigail prompted, though she suspected she knew. To build a life together, he finished diplomatically. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels finding familiar ruts in the mountain road. The landscape was breathtaking in its wild beauty. Towering pines, rocky outcroppings, and views that stretched for miles. But it was also isolated, in a way that made Abigail's chest tighten with sudden loneliness. "Mr. Calloway, Thaddius," she began carefully, "I need you to understand something about me, about why I'm here." His hands stilled on the reins. "You told me in your letter." "I told you the facts, but I need you to understand what they mean." She folded her hands in her lap, gathering courage. "I may never be able to give you children. The doctor in Boston was quite certain. If that's truly important to you, Miss Turner," his voice was firm but not unkind, "I didn't ask you to come here under false pretenses. You were honest in your letter, more honest than you needed to be. That tells me something about your character. But children would be a blessing if they come. But they're not the only reason a man takes a wife." He looked directly at her then, those dark eyes serious. "I've been alone for 5 years, Miss Turner. I've built a good life, but it's a solitary one. I want someone to share it with, someone to talk to in the evenings, someone to work alongside, someone who won't run when times get hard." The wagon rounded a bend, and Abigail caught her first glimpse of what would be her new home. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, larger than she'd expected, with a stone chimney already sending smoke into the crisp afternoon air. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, a smokehouse, what looked like a workshop. A vegetable garden showed the brown stubble of the season's final harvest, but it was the rocking chair on the front porch that caught her attention. Hand-carved, with smooth curves that spoke of careful craftsmanship and winter evenings spent in patient work. Something about it made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You made that," she said softly. "The chair?" "Yes." His voice carried a note of self-consciousness, something to do during the long evenings. As the wagon rolled to a stop in front of the cabin, Abigail felt the weight of the moment settling around her like a heavy cloak. This was it, her new life, her last chance, her leap of faith into the unknown. Tomorrow, if they both agreed, they would be married. Tonight, she would sleep under his roof as his intended bride. "Miss Turner," Thaddeus said as he climbed down from the wagon. "Before we go any further, I have one question for you." She looked down at him from the wagon seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What is it? Will you give me sons?" The question hung between them like a challenge and a prayer combined. Not, "Can you give me sons?" with its implications of her medical limitations, but "will you?" As if her willingness mattered more than her ability. As if he saw something in her that she'd stopped seeing in herself. For the first time in 2 years, Abigail Turner felt a spark of hope kindle in her. "Chest," the words echoed in the mountain air between them. Simple yet weighted, with more meaning than Abigail had heard in years. "Will you give me sons?" Not a demand, not a test of her biological capabilities, but a question that seemed to reach past her medical diagnosis to something deeper. She climbed down from the wagon without his assistance, needing the moment to steady herself on solid ground. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her travel-worn skirts, acutely aware of his patient gaze waiting for her answer. "I don't know if I can," she said finally, the honesty scraping her throat raw. "Dr. Pemberton in Boston said my womb is tilted. That conception would be unlikely. Charles, my former fiancé, he broke our engagement because of it." Thaddeus lifted her carpet bag from the wagon bed, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "That's not what I asked you. I don't understand the difference. Can't and won't are different things entirely." He set the bag on the porch beside the rocking chair. "A man can build the finest house in the territory, but if lightning strikes he's still lost his home. That doesn't make him less of a builder." Abigail stared at him, this mountain of a man who spoke in metaphors that somehow cut straight to the heart of her deepest fears. "You're saying it wouldn't be my fault if—" "I'm saying I'd rather have a woman who wants to try than one who can, but won't." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "So I'll ask again, Miss Turner. Will you give me sons?" The marriage contract letter crinkled in her reticule as she shifted her weight. That formal document that had brought her across half a continent, suddenly feeling less like a business arrangement and more like a leap of faith. "Yes," she whispered, then cleared her throat and said it stronger. "Yes, I will try to give you sons." Something shifted in his expression, a subtle softening around his eyes that made him seem less intimidating and more hopeful. "Then we understand each other." He led her up the porch steps, past the rocking chair that now seemed to promise long evenings and quiet conversations. The cabin door opened to reveal a single large room with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a simple kitchen area with a cast-iron stove and stairs leading to what she assumed was a sleeping loft. It was clean, sparse, and undeniably masculine. No curtains softened the windows, no decorative touches warmed the rough-hewn walls, but it was solid, built to last, and the fire crackling in the hearth chased away the mountain chill. "There's a partition upstairs," Thaddeus said, apparently reading her thoughts about sleeping arrangements. "You can have the room on the right. I built it thinking, well, for privacy. Thank you." She set her carpet bag beside the stairs, suddenly exhausted from the day's travel and the weight of momentous decisions. "When would you like to have the ceremony?" "Tomorrow, if you're agreeable. Pastor Williams comes through Silver Creek every 2 weeks, and he's due in the morning. We could ride down together, get it done proper." He paused, studying her face. "Unless you need more time to be certain, more time to think would only give her more reasons to doubt herself." "Tomorrow is fine." "Good." He moved to the kitchen area, his large frame somehow fitting naturally in the space. "You hungry?" "Got venison stew from yesterday, and Martha Henderson sent along some of her sourdough bread when she heard you were coming." The mention of food made Abigail realize she hadn't eaten since the brief stop at the last way station. "That would be very kind, thank you." As he ladled stew into wooden bowls, she found herself studying his movements. Everything he did seemed deliberate, efficient, as if he'd long ago learned to waste neither motion nor resources. When he handed her a bowl, their fingers brushed briefly, his warm and calloused, hers cold and soft from city living. They ate in silence at his simple wooden table, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant call of a mountain bird. The stew was rich and perfectly seasoned, better than anything she'd expected from a bachelor's kitchen. "You cook well," she said finally. "Man learns to take care of himself out here, or he doesn't survive long." He sopped up gravy with a piece of bread. "Though I'll admit it'll be nice to have someone else's cooking for a change. You any good in the kitchen?" "I grew up in my father's bakery. I can manage bread, pastries, basic meals." She hesitated. "I'm not afraid of hard work, if that's what you're wondering." "Good. Winter's coming and there's plenty to do before the snows set in. Preserving, wood-cutting, preparing the animals." He glanced at her city clothes. "We'll need to get you some practical things, boots, work dresses, a proper coat." The conversation felt surreal, planning a life together with a man she'd known for less than 2 hours, yet somehow it felt more honest than any of the flowery courtship rituals she'd endured with Charles. "Mr. Calloway, Thaddius," she began. carefully. I need to know what you expect from this marriage, beyond children." He set down his spoon and leaned back in his chair, considering her question with the same seriousness he might give to planning a difficult hunt. "I expect honesty between us. No games, no pretending to be something you're not." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I expect you to pull your weight around here. This isn't easy country, and I can't carry a woman who won't work. And in return, you'll never want for food, shelter, or protection as long as I'm breathing. I'll treat you with respect. Never raise my hand to you. And when we have disagreements, and we'll settle them with words, not silence." He paused. "And I'll share my bed with you if you're willing, when you're ready." Heat crept up Abigail's neck at his frank words. Charles had never spoken so directly about the physical aspects of marriage, preferring flowery euphemisms that left her confused and nervous. "When I'm ready?" "You've had a long journey and a lot of changes. I'm not a brute, Miss Turner. When you come to my bed, it should be because you want to, not because you feel obligated." The kindness in his words nearly undid her composure. "And if I can't give you children despite trying, then we'll face that when it comes. But I won't cast you aside like some defective merchandise." His eyes hardened slightly. "Whatever else happens between us, you'll never have to wonder if you're wanted under this roof." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes and looked away quickly, not wanting him to see her weakness. But when she glanced back, his expression held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that suggested he knew something about being unwanted himself. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you've lived through a Montana winter." But there was a hint of warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. As evening settled over the mountains, Thaddeus showed her the rest of his property: the barn with its 3 horses and 2 milk cows, the smokehouse where he preserved meat for winter, the workshop where he'd carved that rocking chair during long, solitary evenings. "Built most of this myself," he said with quiet pride, as they walked back toward the cabin. "Bought the land with my army pay and started from nothing." "You were a soldier, infantry during the war. 4 years of it." His jaw tightened. "Came home to nothing much, so I headed west. Figured a man could build something better out here." Another piece of his story, shared with the same careful deliberation he showed in everything else. Abigail found herself wondering what other secrets lay behind his steady demeanor. That night, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her temporary room, she carried with her the marriage contract letter that had brought them together. By lamplight, she read through its formal language once more, but now the words seemed different, less like a business transaction and more like the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Thaddius Calloway. Tonight, for the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to believe that might not be a tragedy after all. The wedding of Abigail Turner and Thaddeus Calloway was the simplest ceremony Silver Creek had witnessed in years. Pastor Williams, a weathered man in his 60s who traveled a circuit of mountain communities, performed the service in the small church with only Martha and Pete Henderson as witnesses. Abigail wore her best dress, navy blue wool with pearl buttons, while Thaddeus had cleaned up considerably in a pressed white shirt and his only suit jacket. They stood before the simple wooden altar, 2 practical people making practical vows, yet something in the way he held her hand during the ceremony suggested this was more than mere convenience for him. "Do you, Thaddeus, take Abigail to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" "I do." His voice carried clearly through the small space. "And do you, Abigail, take Thaddeus to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" "I do." The words came out steadier than she'd expected. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Thaddeus." The kiss was brief, gentle, more promise than passion. But when Thaddeus's lips touched hers, Abigail felt something shift inside her chest, a small, warm recognition that this man meant to honor his vows. "Martha," Henderson had prepared a simple wedding breakfast at the general store, and half the town seemed to find reasons to stop by and meet the new Mrs. Calloway. The attention made Abigail nervous, but Thaddeus stayed close, his large presence a reassuring anchor as she navigated introductions and well-meaning advice. "You'll want to get your preserving done soon," advised Mrs. Morrison, the doctor's wife. "First snows can come early up, in the foothills. Jack's got a good spread," added Tom Fletcher, who ran the livery stable. "Built it to last. You picked a good man, Mrs. Calloway." Mrs. Calloway. The name felt foreign on her tongue, yet somehow right in a way that Mrs. Whitmore never had. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The reality of their situation was settling in now. They were married, legally bound, and heading home to begin building a life together. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the mountain road. "Any regrets?" Thaddeus asked suddenly. "No," Abigail said, and realized she meant it. "You?" "No, ma'am. Though I should warn you, the work's about to get hard. Winter preparations wait for no one." He wasn't exaggerating. Over the following days, Abigail discovered just how much effort it took to survive in the Montana wilderness. There were vegetables to harvest and preserve, meat to smoke, firewood to split and stack. Her hands, soft from city living, quickly developed blisters and calluses, but there was also her mother's recipe book, carefully packed in her carpet bag and now occupying a place of honor on Thaddeus's kitchen shelf. The familiar handwriting and time-tested recipes became her lifeline as she learned to cook on the wood stove, to judge temperatures by feel, and to stretch provisions through creative meal planning. "This is excellent," Thaddeus said one evening, taking a second helping of her apple pandodi made from fruit stored in his root cellar. "It was my mother's recipe. She always said the secret was to let the apples cook down properly before adding the biscuit topping. She taught you well." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Tell me about her." It was the first truly personal question he'd asked, and Abigail found herself describing her mother's gentle ways, her skill in the bakery, the way she'd hummed while she worked. Talking about Margaret Turner made the loss feel both sharper and somehow more bearable. "She died 3 years ago," Abigail concluded. "Consumption. I nursed her through the worst of it." "That's hard nursing. You did right by her." Thaddeus's understanding was matter-of-fact but genuine. "My own mother passed when I was 12. Childbirth fever. Sometimes I think that's why I—" He stopped abruptly. "Why you what?" "Why I want children so much, I suppose. Want to give them the mothering?" I lost. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Abigail felt her heart squeeze with unexpected tenderness for this big, careful man who'd learned to protect himself by saying little. Their days fell into a rhythm. Thaddeus would rise before dawn to tend the animals, while Abigail started the fire and began breakfast. They worked together through the morning hours, she in the garden and kitchen, he handling the heavier outdoor chores. Afternoons brought shared tasks, preserving the last of the harvest, mending tools and clothing, preparing for the long winter ahead. Evenings were the strangest time. They would sit by the fire after supper, Thaddeus often whittling or mending, harness, while Abigail sewed or read from one of his few books. They talked about practical matters, the weather, work to be done, supplies needed from town. But underneath the mundane conversations, Abigail sensed deeper currents she didn't yet understand. He was unfailingly courteous, never raised his voice, and seemed to anticipate her needs before she voiced them. When her back ached from bending over the washboard, he wordlessly took over the heavy lifting. When she struggled with the intricacies of his wood-burning stove, he patiently showed her the tricks of managing the dampers and drafts. Yet for all his consideration, they remained essentially strangers sharing a house. He'd kept his word about not pressuring her, sleeping alone in the left side of the loft while she occupied the partitioned room on the right. Sometimes at night, she could hear him moving about, the soft creak of floorboards that suggested he slept as poorly as she did. One evening, as she worked on mending one of his shirts by lamplight, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No, just you look at home here, content." "I am, I think." The admission surprised her. "I expected to miss Boston more than I do." "Nothing to miss?" "My sister Elizabeth. Some of the familiar routines." She set down her sewing. "But Boston felt like a place I was trying to fit into, not somewhere I belonged. This feels different." "How so?" She considered the question, trying to put the feeling into words. "Like, I'm needed here, not tolerated or pitied, but actually needed." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that made her stomach flutter strangely. "You are needed, Abigail, more than you know." The use of her first name, which he'd been doing more often lately, sent heat creeping up her neck. There was something in the way he said it that made it sound like an endearment. I should finish this mending," she stammered, suddenly flustered. "Of course." But he continued watching her work, and she found her hands trembling slightly under his steady gaze. Later that night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the wind in the pines, Abigail found herself thinking about the man on the other side of the thin partition. She was beginning to understand that Thaddeus Calloway was far more complex than his quiet demeanor suggested. There were depths to him she was only beginning to glimpse: kindness, loneliness, and something else that made her pulse quicken when he looked at her a certain way. For the first time since Charles's rejection, she found herself wondering what it might be like to be truly wanted by a man, not as a convenient arrangement or a suitable match, but desired for herself alone. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as she drifted towards sleep with the mountain silence wrapped around the cabin like a blanket, Abigail Turner Calloway found herself looking forward to tomorrow. October arrived with a sharp frost that turned the aspen leaves to gold and reminded everyone that winter was stalking the high country. Abigail woke one morning to find ice crystals on the inside of her bedroom window and the smell of wood smoke heavy in the air from Thaddius keeping the fire burning through the night. She'd been married 3 weeks now, and the rhythms of mountain life were becoming natural to her. Her hands had toughened, her back had strengthened, and she'd learned to read the sky for weather signs the way she'd once read the social cues of Boston drawing rooms. What she hadn't learned was how to read. Her husband, Thaddius, remained unfailingly kind, respectful, and distant. They worked well together, talked easily about practical matters, and had settled into domestic routines that felt comfortable. Yet beneath the surface civility, Abigail sensed currents she couldn't navigate. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, but he always looked away before she could interpret it. The discovery came by accident on a grey afternoon when she was searching the barn loft for additional wool blankets. Winter was coming fast, and she wanted to make sure they had enough warm bedding for the cold months ahead. Tucked behind a crate of preserved goods, her hand encountered something wrapped in oilcloth. She almost left it alone. Thaddeus was entitled to his privacy, but curiosity got the better of her discretion. Inside the wrapping was a military medal, a congressional decoration with worn ribbon and tarnished silver. Beneath it lay a small bundle of letters tied with string, and a daguerreotype of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Find what you were looking for?" Abigail spun around, the medal still in her hands, to find Thaddeus standing at the top of the loft ladder. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "I'm sorry. I was looking for blankets, and I found this by accident. I didn't mean to pry." She held out the medal, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Keep it for now." He climbed the rest of the way into the loft, moving with his usual deliberate care. "Might as well tell you about it, since you've seen it." He sat down on a hay bale across from her, his large frame folding gracefully despite the low roof beams. For a long moment he studied his hands before speaking. "Medal of Honor. Got it at Antietam for rallying the men when our lieutenant was killed. Kept them from breaking when the Confederates counterattacked." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. Lost more friends that day than I care to remember. You were a hero. I was a soldier who did his job. He looked up at her then. The photograph, that's Sarah. We were engaged before I left for the war. Abigail's stomach clenched unexpectedly. What happened to her? Wrote me a letter my 3rd year in. Said she couldn't wait anymore. Was marrying her banker's son. Got the letter the same day we buried half my company after Chancellorsville. He was quiet for a moment. Can't say I blamed her. What changes a man? And I was already different than the boy who'd left. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but she meant them. Ancient history now. But those letters, they're from her. Kept them as a reminder, I suppose, of what I lost, what I learned. He gestured toward the medal. Same with that. Reminds me that honor's not just about glory. Sometimes it's about keeping your word when it costs you everything. There was something in his tone that made Abigail look at him more closely. Is that what this marriage is to you? Keeping your word at great cost? No. His answer was immediate and firm. But I wanted you to understand something about me, Abigail. I don't make promises lightly. When I married you, when I said I'd care for you and protect you, I meant it. Even if, especially if things don't work out the way we hope. The children, you mean, among other things. He stood up, brushing hay from his pants. Come winter, we'll be snowed in together for months. You should know the man you're living with. That evening, the atmosphere between them felt different. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with new understanding. Thaddeus had shared something precious and painful with her, and Abigail found herself seeing him with fresh eyes. As she prepared supper, she caught herself stealing glances at him. The medal had revealed the young soldier he'd been, brave and honorable, but it was the story of Sarah that lingered in her mind. Another woman who'd found him wanting, another promise broken. No wonder he held himself so carefully distant. Abigail. His voice interrupted her thoughts. There's something else I should tell you. She set down her wooden spoon and turned to face him. What is it? I built this cabin with a family in mind. The loft has 2 rooms because I was planning for children. He paused, his jaw working as if the words were difficult. The workshop out back. There's something in there I want you to see. After supper, he led her through the gathering dusk to his workshop. The building was larger than she'd expected, filled with well-maintained tools and several pieces of furniture in various stages of completion. But it was the object in the far corner that made her breath catch. A baby cradle, half-finished, carved from beautiful golden pine. The rockers were complete, smooth and perfectly balanced, and the headboard showed intricate scrollwork that must have taken hours to achieve. It was clearly a labor of love, created by hands that longed to hold a child. Started it last winter, Thaddeus said quietly. Something to do during the long evenings. Figured when I found a wife, we'd need it eventually. Abigail reached out to touch the smooth wood, her fingers tracing the delicate carvings. It's beautiful. You're very skilled. My father was a carpenter back in Ohio. Taught me the trade. Before he died, he moved to stand beside her, his large hands gentle as he adjusted one of the rockers. Always found woodworking peaceful. Gives a man time to think. What did you think about while you were making this? Family. What it would feel like to have children running around this place. Someone to teach, to leave something to. He glanced at her. What it would be like to have a wife who wanted to build that with me. The longing in his voice was unmistakable, and it tugged at something deep in Abigail's chest. This strong, self-sufficient man had secret dreams just like she did. He'd spent lonely winter nights crafting a cradle for children who might never come, just as she'd once embroidered tiny gowns with hope and heartbreak. Thaddius, she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was feeling. What is it? I want that too. The family, the children. I want to fill this cradle with babies and watch them grow up in this beautiful place. She took a shaky breath. But I'm scared. What if I can't give you what you want? What if Dr. Pemberton was right? He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious. Then we'll love the children we have in other ways. There are orphans in mining camps, kids who need homes. There are nephews and nieces to spoil. There are 100 ways to build a family, Abigail. You'd be satisfied with that? I'd be satisfied with you. The words were simple, but the weight behind them made her knees weak. You're not a means to an end. You're the end itself. Before she could lose her courage, Abigail stepped closer to him. Then why do we sleep apart? Why do you treat me like a guest in your own home? Something flashed in his eyes, surprise, heat, and something else that made her pulse jump. Because you haven't seemed ready. Because I wanted you to feel safe here before what? Before I asked you to be my wife in truth as well as name. The space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities. Abigail had never been the forward one in courtship, had always waited for the man to make the first move. But something about this mountain-strong man who carved cradles in lonely workshops made her braver than she'd ever been. I'm asking now, she whispered. For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then his large hands came up to frame her face with exquisite gentleness, and he kissed her the way she'd never been kissed before, not politely, not tentatively, but like a man who'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thaddeus rested his forehead against hers. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Abigail Turner Calloway climbed the stairs to the left side of the loft. And for the first time since she was a young woman with dreams of love, she discovered what it meant to be truly wanted. November arrived with the year's first real snowfall, 3 inches of pristine white that transformed the mountain landscape into something from a fairy tale. Abigail woke in Thaddeus's strong arms to find frost flowers blooming on the bedroom window and the world outside muffled in winter's hush. The change in their relationship had been swift and profound. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved overnight, replaced by an intimacy that felt both natural and miraculous. Thaddeus was a gentle lover, patient and attentive, and Abigail discovered that her body was capable of responses she'd never imagined during her chaste engagement to Charles. More than the physical closeness, though, was the emotional connection that had bloomed between them. They talked now during the long evenings, really talked, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. The walls they'd both built around their hearts were coming down brick by careful brick. "Tell me about your father's bakery," Thaddeus said one evening as they sat by the fire. He was working on finishing the baby cradle, sanding the intricate scrollwork to silky smoothness, while she pressed wildflowers between the pages of an old book. "It smelled like heaven every morning," Abigail said, carefully adjusting a delicate mountain violet, yeast and cinnamon and fresh bread. Papa would start the ovens before dawn, and by the time Elizabeth and I came down for breakfast, the whole house would be warm and fragrant. "Oh, you miss it." "I miss him. He had such gentle hands for such a big man, rather like you." She glanced at him meaningfully, and he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. He could shape dough like it was silk, create beautiful loaves and pastries that people would travel across town to buy. Sounds like he loved his work. He did. Said there was something godly about feeding people, about turning simple flour and water into something that nourished families. She pressed another flower, this one a tiny white bloom she'd found by the creek. When he died, Elizabeth's husband sold the bakery, said it was too much trouble for women to manage. "But you could have managed it." "I thought so." But Edward, Elizabeth's husband, he had other plans, said unmarried women shouldn't be in trade. The old hurt still stung, but less sharply now. "I think that's part of why I accepted Charles' proposal so quickly. I wanted to show them I could be successful at something." Thaddeus set down his sandpaper and looked at her directly. "You are successful. Look what you've accomplished here in just 2 months." Abigail glanced around their cozy cabin. The walls now sported her mother's embroidered samplers. The kitchen shelves held neat rows of preserves she'd made from his garden, and the windows were dressed with simple curtains she'd sewn from fabric bought in town. More than decoration, though, the space felt like a home now, instead of just a bachelor's dwelling. I suppose I have, haven't I? The realization brought a warm glow to her chest. This feels more like mine than the house in Boston ever did. That's because you built it with your own hands. No one can take that away from you. His words carried deeper meaning, and she understood he wasn't just talking about homemaking skills. Here in this mountain valley, she was becoming someone new, stronger, more confident, more certain of her own worth. The pressed flower collection had started almost by accident. Walking to the creek for water one morning, she'd noticed the incredible variety of wildflowers that bloomed in their valley, many of them species she'd never seen in New England. On impulse, she'd picked a few particularly beautiful specimens and pressed them in her mother's recipe book. Now, as winter approached and the last blooms faded, she'd assembled quite a collection. Mountain violets, Indian paintbrush, delicate, alpine forget-me-nots, and dozens of others. Each flower represented a day of her new life, a moment of beauty discovered in this wild place. "What will you do with them all?" Thaddeus asked, watching her work. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe make a book or frame some of the prettiest ones." She held up a perfect columbine, its blue and white petals preserved forever. "I want to remember this first year, every detail of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. They make the beautiful parts more precious." He reached over and touched her hand gently. "You're not the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach." "No, I'm not." She interlaced their fingers, still marveling at how right it felt to touch him freely. That woman was frightened and defeated. She thought her life was essentially over. And now she's learning that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. December brought the serious snows, the kind that piled 4 feet deep and didn't melt until spring. They were truly isolated now, cut off from town, until the weather broke enough for the horses to navigate the drifted roads. But instead of feeling trapped, Abigail felt cocooned in warmth and contentment. Their days took on a peaceful rhythm. Thaddeus would tend to the animals morning and evening, chopping paths through the snow and making sure they had adequate food and shelter. Between times, he worked on indoor projects, finishing the cradle, building a new bookshelf for their small collection of volumes, crafting kitchen tools that made Abigail's work easier. She kept the house warm and welcoming, prepared hearty meals from their preserved stores, and worked on various domestic projects. She'd started knitting baby clothes from wool she'd spun herself, tiny gowns and blankets that would be ready if they were needed. On the longest nights, they would sit close together by the fire, sharing stories and dreams. Thaddeus told her about his childhood in Ohio, his father's carpentry shop, the way his mother had sung lullabies in German. She spoke of Boston, her family, the dreams she'd harbored as a young woman, about the life she'd built with a loving husband. "I used to imagine hosting dinner parties," she admitted one snowy evening, "having a beautiful dining room with china and crystal, entertaining Charles's business associates and their wives." Sounds lonely. It was, even in my imagination. "I was always worried about saying the wrong thing, serving the wrong course, being found wanting somehow." She curled closer to him on the settee he'd built for their sitting area. "This is better. A cabin in the wilderness with no society for miles, a home with someone who loves me exactly as I am." The word hung between them. Love. They hadn't spoken it yet, though Abigail felt it growing stronger each day. She could see it in the way he looked at her, hear it in his voice when he spoke her name, feel it in the gentle way he touched her, but neither had been brave enough to say it. "Aloud, Abigail," he said quietly. "Yes, I do, love you exactly as you are." Her heart swelled until she thought it might burst from her chest. "I love you too," she whispered against his shoulder, "more than I ever thought possible." They held each other in the firelight, snow falling steadily outside their warm sanctuary, and Abigail marveled at how completely her life had transformed. 6 months ago, she'd been a discarded woman with no prospects and little hope. Now she was cherished, valued, building something beautiful with a man who saw her worth. That night, as they lay entwined in their bed, with the wind howling around the cabin, Abigail allowed herself to dream of the children they might have. Sons, with their father's steady strength and gentle hands. Daughters who would grow up knowing they were precious and capable of anything. A house filled with laughter and love. The baby cradle finally serving its intended purpose. She pressed her hand to her still flat belly, sending up a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening. Let me give him this. Let me prove Dr. Pemberton wrong. Let our love create the family we both want so desperately. The mountain wind answered with a long, mournful wail, carrying her hopes up into the star-studded darkness where dreams and wishes went to await their fate. January's bitter cold gave way to February's promise of spring, though snow still lay thick on the ground and would for weeks to come. It was on a morning when pale sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows that Abigail first noticed the change in her body. She'd been feeling queasy for several days, attributing it to a batch of preserved venison that had tasted slightly off. But when the smell of coffee, previously one of her favorite morning rituals, sent her rushing outside to be sick in the snow, she began to suspect something wonderful and terrifying. Her monthly courses, never particularly regular, had been absent since December. At first, she'd blamed the change in diet, the physical demands of mountain life, the stress of adapting to marriage. But as she knelt in the snow, retching while Thaddeus held her hair and murmured soothing words, hope and fear warred in her chest. Better, he asked gently as her stomach finally settled. I think so. She accepted his help to stand, her legs shaky. Thaddeus, I think I might be pregnant? The word came out rough with emotion. Maybe. I'm not certain yet. But the signs... She pressed her hand to her abdomen. Should I be afraid to hope? His large hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing away tears. She didn't realize she was crying. Hope is all we have, sweetheart. Hope and faith and each other. Dr. Morrison wouldn't be able to travel up to the homestead until the spring. Thaw. So they had to rely on their own observations and the wisdom passed down through generations of frontier women. Martha Henderson had given Abigail a book about childbirth and infant care when she'd married Thaddeus, and now she studied it with the intensity of a scholar. The symptoms continued and strengthened. Morning sickness that gradually gave way to a bone-deep weariness, changes in her body that became more pronounced each day. By March, when the first green shoots began pushing through the melting snow, there was no denying the miracle growing within her. I can't believe it, she said one evening, standing sideways before their small mirror and marveling at the subtle curve of her belly. Dr. Pemberton was so certain I'd never conceive. Doctors don't know everything, Thaddeus said from their bed, where he was propped against pillows watching her, with an expression of wonder and possessive pride. Maybe you just needed the right partner, or maybe I needed to stop believing. I was broken. She turned to face him, her hand resting protectively over their child. I spent so much time thinking something was wrong with me that I never considered the problem might have been with him. Charles. He never seemed particularly interested in the physical aspects of marriage. Our courtship was very proper, very restrained. Heat crept up her neck as she spoke of such intimate matters, but Thaddeus had a way of making her feel safe to voice her deepest thoughts. With you, everything feels different, natural, right. Come here, he said softly, and she went willingly into his arms. You're perfect exactly as you are. Don't let anyone, not doctors, not former fiancés, not anyone, tell you otherwise. The baby began making its presence known in earnest as spring arrived in the high country. Abigail's belly rounded noticeably, and she had to let out the seams on her dresses to accommodate her changing figure. But more than the physical changes were the emotional ones. The fierce protectiveness she felt for this tiny life, the way her hand unconsciously sought her abdomen throughout the day, the dreams she had of holding a dark-haired child with Thaddeus's steady eyes. Thaddeus was equally transformed. Always attentive, he became almost absurdly protective. insisting she avoid heavy lifting and worrying when she showed the slightest sign of fatigue. He moved the finished baby cradle from his workshop to their bedroom, positioning it near her side of the bed, where she could see it from the pillow. "Too early for that, don't you think?" she teased, though the sight of it made her heart sing with joy. Never too early to be prepared. He ran his hand along the smooth wood with obvious pride. "Besides, I like looking at it. Makes it feel real." As her pregnancy progressed, they began making practical preparations for the birth. Thaddeus built a special birthing chair based on descriptions in Martha's book, while Abigail sewed tiny clothes and receiving blankets. They discussed names during long evening conversations, James for a boy, after Thaddeus's father, or Sarah for a girl, a choice that surprised her until he explained. "She was part of my past, but she's not part of my future," he said simply. "If we have a daughter, I want to honor what was while celebrating what is." The generosity of spirit behind his words made Abigail love him even more, if such a thing were possible. Her pressed wildflower collection took on new significance as her pregnancy progressed. Each bloom represented not just her own journey of healing and growth, but the promise of new life she would soon bring into the world. She began imagining walking these mountain paths with a child, teaching a son or daughter to identify the different flowers, sharing the beauty that had helped her fall in love with this wild place. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked one night, voicing the fear that haunted her dreams. "What if I lose the baby, like I lost everything else? Then we'll grieve together and try again," Thaddeus said, his voice steady in the darkness. "But that's not going to happen. You're strong, Abigail, stronger than you know." "How can you be so certain?" "Because I've watched you transform from a defeated woman into someone who could conquer the world if she set her mind to it. You survived, losing your parents, a broken engagement, traveling across the country alone to marry a stranger. You've thrived in one of the harshest environments on earth." His hand found hers beneath the quilts. "This baby is lucky to have you as a mother." His faith in her was both humbling and empowering. As spring gave way to summer and her belly grew round and full, Abigail felt herself becoming the woman she was always meant to be. Not the timid, self-doubting creature who'd left Boston, but someone capable, confident, and deeply loved. The first labor pains came on a warm August morning when wildflowers bloomed in glorious profusion across their mountain valley. As Abigail doubled over with the first contraction, her hand instinctively reached for the latest addition to her pressed flower collection. A perfect alpine forget-me-not she'd picked just yesterday, its blue petals the color of hope itself. "It's in time," she told Thaddeus, and saw her own mixture of excitement and terror reflected in his dark eyes. Their child was coming, and with it the final proof that love could indeed work miracles. The letter arrived on a September morning when the aspens were turning gold, and Abigail was finally feeling strong enough to venture beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin. Their son, James Thomas Calloway, had been born 3 weeks earlier after a difficult but successful labor, and she was slowly recovering her strength while marveling at the tiny miracle who had already wrapped his parents completely around his diminutive fingers. She was sitting on the porch, nursing the baby and enjoying the crisp mountain air, when she saw the rider approaching their homestead. It was Tom Fletcher from the livery stable, and the grim expression on his weathered face suggested this wasn't a social call. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Got a letter for you. Came through on yesterday's stage. Marked urgent." Abigail's stomach clenched with sudden apprehension. Urgent letters rarely brought good news, and she'd been so blissfully happy these past weeks that she'd almost forgotten the outside world existed. "Thank you, Tom." She accepted the envelope with one hand while keeping James securely cradled against her chest. "Would you like some coffee? You've ridden a long way." "No, Mom, thank you kindly. Got to get back before the weather turns." He glanced at the heavy clouds gathering over the peaks. "Storm coming in tonight, looks like." After he left, Abigail stared at the letter for a long time before opening it. The return address was Boston, written in an elegant masculine hand. She recognized with a shock of dismay Charles Whitmore, a name from a life she'd thought was buried forever. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the expensive stationery. "My dearest Abigail, I hope this letter finds you well, though I confess I have been greatly disturbed to learn of your current circumstances. Word has reached Boston of your marriage to a frontier settler, and I cannot believe you would choose such a harsh existence when far better options await you. Much has changed since our unfortunate parting. My family's shipping business has expanded considerably, and I have recently been elected to the Massachusetts state legislature. I'm now in a position to offer you the life of comfort and respect you deserve, free from the hardships of frontier living. I was young and foolish when I ended our engagement, influenced by my father's concerns about heirs and property. I have since come to understand that love matters more than such considerations, and I have never stopped loving you, my dear Abigail. I am prepared to travel to Montana Territory to bring you home to Boston, where we can be married, as we always planned. I have means now to ensure you want for nothing, and I have spoken with several doctors who believe your previous diagnosis was overly pessimistic. With proper medical care and comfortable circumstances, there is no reason to believe you cannot bear children. Please consider this carefully. I know you may feel some obligation to the man you married out of desperation, but surely you must see that this was never the life you were meant for. You were born to be a lady, not a pioneer's wife struggling against the elements. I await your immediate reply, and I pray you will see reason. I can have you back in civilization within the month. Your devoted Charles Whitmore." The letter fluttered from Abigail's nerveless fingers as she stared across their beautiful valley. With unseeing eyes, Charles wanted her back. The man who had rejected her, cast her aside as defective goods, now claimed to love her and wanted to rescue her from her harsh existence. "Mama?" Thaddeus's voice came from behind her, warm with concern. He'd taken to calling her that since James's birth, and the endearment never failed to make her heart flutter. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled up from whatever work he'd been doing. He was still the most imposing man she'd ever known, but she'd learned to see past his intimidating exterior to the gentle soul beneath. How could Charles think she would abandon this for Boston drawing rooms and social obligations? "In a way, I have." She picked up the letter with a shaking hand. "This is from Charles Whitmore, my former fiancé." Thaddeus's expression went very still. "What does he want?" "He wants me back. He says he's wealthy now, influential. He claims he never stopped loving me and wants to take me home to Boston." Her voice cracked on the last words. The silence stretched between them, while James made small, contented sounds against her chest. Finally, Thaddeus sat down in the rocking chair beside her, his movements careful and controlled. "What did you tell him?" "I haven't told him anything. The letter just arrived." She looked at him desperately. "Thaddeus, you can't possibly think—" I think," he said quietly, "that you need to consider what's best for you and James." His words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "I mean that man can give you things I never can. Comfort, security, a place in society. Our son could grow up a gentleman instead of a mountain man's boy. I don't want those things. You might someday, when the winters get long and the isolation weighs on you, when you remember what it was like to have servants and fine clothes, and friends to visit." His voice was steady, but she could see the pain he was trying to hide. "I've always known you were too good for this life, Abigail. Maybe this is your chance to claim what you deserve." "What I deserve?" She stood up abruptly, James fussing at the sudden movement. "What I deserve is a husband who doesn't try to send me away at the first sign of trouble." "I'm not sending you away, I'm giving you a choice." "No, you're giving up. You're so convinced I'm going to leave that you're practically packing my bags for me." Tears were streaming down her face now, and James had begun to cry in response to her distress. Thaddeus reached for the baby, and she reluctantly let him. "Oh, take their son." James immediately quieted against his father's broad chest, tiny fist curling around one of Thaddeus's fingers. "Look at him," Thaddeus said softly. "He's going to be tall like me, probably dark-haired and stubborn. In Boston, he could go to Harvard, become a lawyer or a doctor. Out here, he'll be lucky to get through 8th grade. Education isn't everything. Opportunity is. Options are." He looked up at her with those dark eyes she'd learned to love so desperately. "I won't be the man who kept you from a better life, Abigail. I couldn't live with myself, and I couldn't live with myself if I abandoned the man who gave me everything that matters." She knelt beside his chair, grasping his free hand. "Thaddeus, look at me. Really look at me. Do I seem unhappy to you? Do I seem like a woman yearning for something else?" "No," he admitted, "but you might. Years from now, when the novelty wears off and reality sets in. The reality is that I love you more than life itself. The reality is that we have a beautiful son and a home we built together with our own hands. The reality is that Charles Whitmore had his chance and threw it away." Her voice strengthened with conviction. "I'm not the same woman who left Boston, and I'm certainly not the same woman who would have married him out of desperation." For a moment, hope flickered in his eyes. Then his jaw tightened. With familiar stubbornness, "He's coming anyway." "What?" The letter. Read the last part again. With dread growing in her chest, Abigail picked up the discarded pages. Her eyes found the final paragraph she'd missed in her initial shock. "I have already made arrangements to travel west and will arrive in Silver Creek by the end of the month to discuss this matter in person. I trust you will give my proposal the serious consideration it deserves." "He's not giving me a choice," she whispered. "He's just informing me of his decision." Sounds about right for a man like that. Thaddeus's voice had gone hard, the protective edge she'd heard when wild animals threatened their livestock. "He thinks he can just waltz in here and claim what he wants. What are we going to do? We're going to let him come. We're going to listen to what he has to say. And then we're going to let you decide what you want your life to look like." He stood up, still cradling James. "But Abigail, I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll consider his offer seriously. Not just with your heart, but with your head. Think about what kind of life you want for our son, what kind of future you want for yourself." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Promise me you won't stay just because you feel obligated." The request broke something inside her chest. "How can you ask me that? How can you even think I would choose him over you?" "Because I love you too much to trap you in a life you might regret." As storm clouds gathered over their mountain valley and their son slept peacefully in his father's arms, Abigail felt the foundations of her carefully rebuilt world beginning to crack. Charles Whitmore was coming to reclaim her, and the man she loved was apparently willing to let him try. The only question now was whether their love was strong enough to survive the test that was coming. Charles Whitmore arrived in Silver Creek on the last day of September, traveling in a hired coach with leather appointments and brass fittings that gleamed like gold in the autumn sun. Word of his arrival spread through the small frontier town like wildfire. A real Boston gentleman, they said, dressed in fine clothes and carrying himself like he owned the world. Abigail heard about it from Martha Henderson, who rode up to the homestead with her face flushed from excitement and concern. "He's staying at the hotel, asking all manner of questions about you and Thaddeus," Martha reported breathlessly. "Wants to know about your marriage, about the baby, about how you've been living up here." Tom Fletcher said he acted like he couldn't believe civilized folk would choose to live in such primitive conditions. "What did you tell him?" Abigail asked, bouncing James gently as he fussed in her arms. "Told him the truth, that you're the happiest I've ever seen you, and that Thaddeus is one of the finest men in the territory." Martha's eyes flashed with indignation, but he just smiled that superior smile and said he understood I was being loyal to a neighbor. Thaddeus emerged from the barn where he'd been grooming his horses, his face grim. "When's he planning to come up here?" Tomorrow morning, near as I could tell. He asked Pete to rent him a horse, said he had important business at the Calloway place. After Martha left, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thaddeus went about his evening chores with mechanical precision, while Abigail tried to focus on caring for James and preparing supper. But both of them kept glancing toward the mountain road as if they could will Charles to disappear through sheer force of concentration. That night, they lay in bed without speaking, the space between them feeling vast despite their physical closeness. James slept peacefully in his cradle, unaware that his world might be about to change forever. "Thaddeus," Abigail whispered into the darkness. "Yeah? Do you want me to stay?" The silence stretched so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "More than I want my next breath. But wanting something doesn't make it right. What if I think it's right? Then I'll trust your judgment. But I need you to be honest with yourself, Abigail. Don't stay because you think it's what I want to hear." She turned to face him in the darkness, wishing she could see his expression. "I'm going to tell him no, you know. I'm going to send him back to Boston alone." "Are you?" "Yes. Because this is my home, you're my husband, and James is our son. Because I'd rather face 100 Montana winters than spend one day pretending to be someone I'm not." She reached for his hand beneath the quilts. "Because I love you, and love isn't something you abandon when a better offer comes along." He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss there. "I hope you still feel that way after you see him again." "I will." But even as she spoke the words with complete conviction, a small part of her wondered what it would be like to see Charles again, to remember the life she'd once thought she wanted. Charles arrived the next morning precisely at 10 o'clock, as punctual as he'd always been. Abigail watched from the kitchen window as he rode up their mountain path, noting how out of place he looked in his fine Eastern clothes and polished boots. He sat his hired horse awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. With the frontier-bred animal's spirited nature, he was still handsome, she had to admit, tall and lean with fair hair and refined features that belonged in Boston drawing rooms. But where Thaddeus's size suggested strength and capability, Charles's elegance seemed somehow fragile against the backdrop of wild mountains and endless sky. "I'll handle this," Thaddeus said quietly, checking the load on his grandfather's hunting rifle before placing it within easy reach by the door. "We'll handle this," Abigail corrected. Together, they walked out to meet their unexpected guest. As he dismounted with careful precision, Charles's eyes went immediately to Abigail, and she saw his face soften with what appeared to be genuine affection. "My dear Abigail," he said, removing his hat with a flourish, "you look—" He paused, clearly struggling for words. "Well, you look well." "Thank you, Charles. You look exactly the same." She kept her voice polite but distant. "This is my husband, Thaddeus Calloway, Thaddeus Charles Whitmore." The two men sized each other up with the careful assessment of potential adversaries. Charles had to crane his neck to meet Thaddeus's eyes, and Abigail saw him swallow hard as he took in her husband's imposing presence. "Mr. Calloway," Charles said, extending his hand with forced cordiality, "I appreciate you receiving me in your home." "Mr. Whitmore," Thaddeus shook the offered hand briefly, "though I should mention this is our home, not just mine." The subtle correction made Charles's jaw tighten slightly, but he maintained his gentleman's composure. "Of course, perhaps we could speak privately. I've traveled a very long way." "Anything you have to say to my wife, you can say in front of me," Thaddeus replied evenly. "I hardly think that's appropriate." "It's appropriate because I say it is." There was steel beneath the polite words. "This is my land, my home, and my wife. You're a guest here, Mr. Whitmore, and you'll abide by my rules or you'll leave." Charles's face flushed with anger, but he clearly recognized he was outmatched physically. "Very well. Abigail, I trust you received my letter?" "I did." "Then you understand why I'm here. I've come to take you home, where you belong." "This is my home," Abigail said firmly. "I belong here." "Do you?" Charles gestured toward the rustic cabin, the outbuildings, the wild landscape surrounding them. Look at this place, Abigail. Look at how you're living. You were meant for better than this. Fine houses, cultured society, the respect that comes with proper position. I have respect here. I have love. You have isolation and hardship. What happens when you grow tired of playing pioneer? What happens when you want to attend the theater, visit museums, converse with educated people? His voice grew more passionate. What happens when you want your son to have opportunities? At the mention of James, something flickered in Thaddeus's eyes, and Abigail felt her heart clench. This was Charles's real weapon, not promises of luxury, but the suggestion that she was depriving her child of a better future. Our son will have opportunities, she said, though her voice wasn't quite as steady as before. What opportunities? To become a farmer? A laborer? Charles pressed his advantage. In Boston, he could attend the finest schools, associate with the best families, become anything he dreams of being. He can become anything he dreams of being right here, Thaddeus said quietly. Character isn't built in drawing rooms, Mr. Whitmore. It's built by hard work, honest dealing, and learning to stand on your own feet. How wonderfully rustic, Charles replied with barely concealed disdain. But surely you can see that the boy would benefit from civilization, from culture, from having his mother torn away from the man who loves her. Thaddeus's voice remained level, but there was something dangerous in his eyes. From learning that promises can be broken whenever something better comes along. I'm not breaking promises. I'm correcting a mistake. Charles turned back to Abigail. My dear, surely you must see that what we had was real. What we have is worth fighting for. What we had was destroyed when you walked away from me, Abigail said, her own temper finally beginning to rise. What you're fighting for now isn't love, Charles, it's pride, it's love. I've never stopped loving you, never stopped regretting my foolish decision. He stepped closer, and she saw Thaddeus tense. I can give you everything I promised before and more. Servants, fine clothes, a place in society. Your son could go to Harvard, become a lawyer or a doctor. Think of what you're denying him by staying here. I'm not denying him anything. I'm giving him parents who love each other and a home built on honesty instead of social expectations. You're giving him poverty and isolation. That's enough. Thaddeus stepped forward, and Charles instinctively backed away. You've said your piece, Whitmore. Now it's time for you to leave. I'm not leaving without Abigail. Yes, you are. Because she's told you no, and because this conversation is over. Charles looked desperately between them, clearly recognizing that his persuasion had failed. Abigail, please, at least consider what I'm offering. Don't make a decision based on emotion. I'm not, she said quietly. I'm making it based on love, real love, not the imitation you offered me 3 years ago. This isn't over, Charles said, his gentleman's mask finally slipping to reveal the entitled man beneath. I have resources, connections. I can make things very difficult for you here. The threat hung in the mountain air like a poisonous cloud. Thaddeus's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he'd left by the door, while Abigail felt ice forming in her stomach. Are you threatening us? She asked. I'm telling you the truth. A man in my position has influence, even out here in the wilderness. Territorial judges are appointed by people I know. Land claims can be challenged. Business licenses can be revoked. His smile was cold and calculating. It would be much easier for everyone if you simply came home willingly. Get off my land, Thaddeus said, his voice deadly quiet. Or what? You'll shoot me? That would only prove my point about the kind of man you are. No, I won't shoot you, but I will break every bone in your body if you threaten my family again. Something in Thaddeus's tone must have convinced Charles he wasn't bluffing. The Boston gentleman mounted his horse with less grace than he'd dismounted, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. This isn't over, Abigail. I'll give you 1 week to come to your senses. After that, the choices become much more limited. He rode away without looking back, leaving Abigail and Thaddeus standing in the yard, with the weight of his threats settling around them like a gathering storm. "He's going to try to destroy us," Abigail said quietly. "Let him try." But there was worry in Thaddeus's voice, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was, that sometimes love wasn't enough to protect the people you cared about from those with power and influence. As they watched Charles disappear down the mountain road, Abigail felt the first stirrings of real fear, not for herself, but for the life they'd built together, and the son who slept peacefully in his cradle, unaware that powerful men were already planning his future. Charles's threats materialized with frightening speed. Within 3 days of his visit to the homestead, Sheriff Brady arrived at their door with official papers and a grim expression that told Abigail their troubles were just beginning. "I'm sorry about this, Thaddeus," Sheriff Brady said, handing over the legal documents. "But I got orders from the territorial judge. There's been a challenge to your land claim." Abigail watched her husband's face go very still as he read through the papers. She knew that look now. It was the same expression he wore when facing dangerous wildlife or severe weather, a mask of calm that concealed careful calculation. "On what grounds?" Thaddeus asked quietly. "Says here you failed to meet the residency requirements, claims you were absent from the property for extended periods during the required proving time." "That's impossible. I've lived here continuously for 5 years. I know that, and you know that, but somebody's filed an affidavit saying otherwise, backed up with witness statements." Sheriff Brady looked uncomfortable. "Word is, there's a Boston businessman willing to pay top dollar for this land, claims he wants to develop it for Eastern investors." The homestead deed that had been Thaddeus's proof of ownership and his claim to the life they'd built together now seemed as fragile as paper in a windstorm. Abigail felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The security she'd found in this mountain valley suddenly revealed as an illusion. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Hearing set for next week in Silver Creek. Judge Morrison will be presiding." Sheriff Brady tipped his hat apologetically. "I'd get yourself a good lawyer if I were you, Thaddeus. This seems like serious business." After the sheriff left, they sat at their kitchen table staring at the legal papers as if they were snakes that might strike at any moment. James fussed in his cradle, picking up on the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. "He can't do this," Abigail said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You built this place. You've lived here for years. You have witnesses." "Who?" "Martha. And Pete Henderson, Tom Fletcher. They're good people, but they're not going to stand up against a man with money and Eastern connections." Thaddeus ran his hands through his hair. Charles was right about one thing. Influence carries weight, even out here. So we fight. We get a lawyer. We gather evidence. We prove you've lived here continuously. With what money? Lawyers cost more than we make in a year, and Charles can afford to drag this out until we're bankrupt. The defeat in his voice made her chest tight with panic. Maybe this is a sign." "A sign of what?" "That you should take his offer. Go back to Boston, give James the life Charles can provide. At least then, something good would come of this." Abigail stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the wooden floor. Don't you dare use this as an excuse to give up on us." "I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic." He looked up at her with eyes full of pain and resignation. "Even if we win the land case, he'll find other ways to make our lives miserable. Men like Charles don't accept defeat gracefully. Then we don't give him the chance to defeat us." That evening, as Thaddeus chopped wood with more violence than the task required, and James slept fitfully in his cradle, Abigail sat at the kitchen table writing letters. Her pen scratched across the paper with determined strokes as she composed messages to every person she could think of who might help them prove Thaddeus's continuous residency. Dr. Morrison, who had delivered supplies and medical care to the homestead multiple times over the years. Pastor Williams, who had performed their wedding and could testify to Thaddeus's reputation in the community. Even the territorial surveyor who had originally marked their property boundaries. But as she sealed each envelope, doubt gnawed at her. Would it be enough? Could their small community of honest frontier folk stand against whatever fabricated evidence Charles had purchased? The next morning brought more troubling news. Tom Fletcher rode up to the homestead with word that Charles had been busy in town, spreading money around like seed and gathering support for his version of events. "He's got 3 men willing to swear they saw your land sitting empty for months at a time," Tom reported, his weathered face creased with worry. "Strangers, but they claim to be former trappers who passed through regular like." "Paid liars," Thaddeus said flatly. "Course they are, but they're dressed nice and speak pretty, and Judge Morrison's new to the territory. He don't know the local folks like Judge Patterson did before he retired." Abigail felt the walls closing in around them. What about character witnesses? People who know Thaddeus's reputation? Charles has been working that angle too, suggesting that mountain men ain't the most reliable sorts, that they stick together against outsiders. Tom's expression was grim. He's painting this as civilization versus lawlessness. That afternoon, Abigail made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her old, timid self. She wrapped James warmly, saddled one of their gentler horses, and rode down to Silver Creek to confront Charles directly. She found him in the hotel dining room, holding court with several well-dressed strangers who were obviously his hired witnesses. When he saw her enter, his face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "Abigail, have you come to your senses at last? I've come to tell you to stop this legal nonsense and leave us alone." His smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid it's gone too far for that. Once legal proceedings are set in motion, you can stop them just as easily as you started them." She kept her voice low but firm, acutely aware of the curious stares from other diners. "Call off your hired witnesses, withdraw your challenge, and go back to Boston." "Why would I do that when I'm so close to getting what I want?" "Because if you don't, I'll fight you with everything I have, and I'll make sure everyone in Massachusetts knows exactly what kind of man Charles Whitmore really is." Something cold flickered in his eyes. "Careful, my dear, you're hardly in a position to make threats." "I'm not threatening. I'm promising." She leaned forward slightly. "I may be just a frontier wife now, but I still have connections in Boston. My sister Elizabeth moves in the same social circles you do. One word from me about your tactics here, and your reputation as a gentleman will be destroyed. No one will believe you over me, won't they? The spurned fiancé who built a new life, or the man who uses his wealth to terrorize families and steal their homes?" She saw uncertainty flicker across his features. "Think about it, Charles. Is your pride really worth your social standing?" For a moment she thought she might have reached him. Then his expression hardened with familiar arrogance. "You've become quite fierce, haven't you? I suppose that's what happens when you live among savages long enough." He signaled the waiter. "For more coffee. But you're still the same naive girl I knew in Boston. You think honor and righteousness can overcome money and influence? How wonderfully romantic. I think love can overcome anything, including you. We'll see about that at the hearing." Abigail left the hotel with her heart pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. Charles might have money and hired witnesses, but she and Thaddeus had something more powerful. They had truth and a community that knew who they really were. The hearing took place in Silver Creek's small courthouse on a crisp October morning when the first snow dusted the mountain peaks. The building was packed beyond capacity, with half the territory's residents crowding in to witness what everyone knew was more than a simple land dispute. It was a battle between 2 different ways of life. Abigail sat in the front row with James in her arms, wearing her best dress and her mother's silver locket. The simple wedding ring Thaddeus had placed on her finger caught the morning light streaming through the courthouse windows, and she twisted it nervously as she watched. The proceedings unfold. Charles sat across the aisle with his lawyer, a sharp-faced man from Helena who wore his city credentials like armor. They'd brought their 3 witnesses, men who claimed to be former trappers, but whose soft hands and clean fingernails suggested they'd never spent a day in the wilderness. Judge Morrison was younger than Abigail had expected, probably in his 40s, with the pale complexion of someone recently arrived from the East. He listened with apparent attention as Charles's lawyer presented their case, painting Thaddeus as an unreliable drifter who had abandoned his claim for months at a time. "Your Honor," the lawyer intoned, "the territorial homestead laws are quite clear about residency requirements. Mr. Calloway may have built structures on this land, but he failed to maintain continuous occupation as required by statute." The first witness took the stand, a thin man who claimed to be a trapper named Johnson. He swore under oath that he'd passed through the area multiple times over the past 3 years and found Thaddeus's homestead empty for extended periods. "How long were these absences?" Charles's lawyer asked. "Weeks at a time, sometimes months. Place looked abandoned half the time I saw it." Abigail felt her heart sink as the man spun his elaborate lies. He spoke convincingly, with enough detail to sound credible to someone unfamiliar with the area. The second and third witnesses told similar stories, each claiming to have observed the homestead sitting empty during critical periods of Thaddeus's proving time. When it came time for their defense, they had no lawyer, just Thaddeus himself, standing tall and steady before the judge despite the magnitude of what he was facing. His voice was calm and clear as he testified about his continuous residency, the improvements he'd made to the land, the life he'd built in their mountain valley. "Your Honor, I've lived on that land every day for the past 5 years, except for occasional trips to town for supplies. I built the cabin, the barn, the outbuildings. I cleared the fields, dug the well, established the garden. That land isn't just my property, it's my home." One by one, their character witnesses took the stand. Dr. Morrison testified about his visits to the homestead for medical emergencies. Martha Henderson spoke of trading supplies with Thaddeus regularly. Pastor Williams described performing their wedding ceremony and seeing the evidence of Thaddeus's permanent settlement. But Abigail could see that Judge Morrison was unmoved by their testimony. To him, these frontier folk probably seemed like simple people who might lie to protect their neighbor against sophisticated Eastern interests. Then something unexpected happened. As Martha Henderson was describing Thaddeus's reputation in the community, the courthouse doors opened, and a figure Abigail didn't recognize entered quietly. He was an older man with a gray beard and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the mountains. Sheriff Brady approached the man and whispered something in his ear. The stranger nodded and took a seat in the back row, his presence causing a stir of recognition among some of the older residents. When Martha finished her testimony, the stranger stood up. "Your Honor, if I may," he said in a voice that carried clear authority, "I have some relevant testimony to offer." Charles's lawyer immediately objected. "This man isn't on the witness list." "I'm Federal Marshal Jake Sullivan," the man said, calmly. "I've been tracking some wanted men through this territory, and I believe I have information pertinent to this case." Judge Morrison leaned forward with interest. "Proceed, Marshal." "Those 3 witnesses who testified about seeing the Calloway homestead empty, I know them. They're not trappers. They're confidence men wanted in 3 territories for fraud and perjury. Been looking for them for months." He reached into his coat and produced wanted posters. Samuel Morrison, alias Johnson, Frank Wheeler, alias Peterson, Tommy Briggs, alias Anderson, all wanted for various crimes involving false testimony and land fraud schemes. The courtroom erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. Charles went pale as his carefully constructed case began to crumble around him. His lawyer frantically whispered in his ear while the 3 fake witnesses looked around desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. "Furthermore," Marshal Sullivan continued, "I've been investigating reports of Eastern businessmen hiring these men to fabricate testimony in land disputes across Montana territory. Seems there's a pattern of wealthy interests using fraud to steal established homesteads from legitimate settlers." Judge Morrison's expression had gone from skeptical to thunderous. "Mr. Whitmore, do you have anything to say about these allegations?" Charles stood on shaking legs, his gentleman's composure finally cracking completely. Your Honor, I was assured these men were legitimate witnesses. If they deceived me, if they deceived you? Abigail couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up, James still in her arms, and faced the man who had tried to destroy her family. You hired them, Charles. You knew they were lying because you told them what lies to tell. That's not, I never... You came here to steal my husband's land because you couldn't accept that I chose him over you. When I wouldn't come back to Boston willingly, you decided to use your money and influence to force me. Her voice grew stronger with each word. You hired these criminals to commit perjury because you thought your pride was worth more than our family's future. The simple wedding ring on her finger caught the light again as she held up her hand. This ring represents vows I made freely to a man who has never lied to me, never abandoned me, never tried to manipulate me into being something I'm not. You think you can buy me like you bought those false witnesses, but I'm not for sale, Charles. I never was. Judge Morrison was already reaching for his gavel. This case is dismissed. Mr. Calloway's homestead claim stands as valid and uncontested. He fixed Charles with a stern stare. Mr. Whitmore, you'll remain in Silver Creek until Marshal Sullivan determines what charges, if any, should be filed against you, and I suggest you consider yourself fortunate that frontier justice has been replaced by territorial law. As the gavel fell, the courtroom burst into cheers from the local residents who had come to support Thaddeus and Abigail. She felt her husband's strong arms wrap around her and James, holding them close as if he'd never let them go again. It's over, he murmured against her hair. Yes, she whispered back, it's over. But as she looked across the courtroom at Charles, defeated, humiliated, and facing possible criminal charges, Abigail felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for the man he'd chosen to become. The boy she'd once thought she loved had been consumed by pride and entitlement, leaving behind only a hollow shell of bitterness and manipulation. She'd made the right choice that day. She'd said yes to Thaddeus's question about giving him sons. Not because of what Charles had become, but because of what she and Thaddeus had built together, a love based on truth, respect, and the kind of partnership that could weather any storm. Spring returned to the Montana mountains with a gentleness that felt like a benediction after the harsh trials of the previous autumn. 2 years had passed since Charles Whitmore's failed attempt to reclaim what he'd never truly possessed, and the scars from that ordeal had faded into distant memory. Abigail stood in her garden, her hands dark with rich soil as she planted the season's first vegetables. At her feet, James toddled through the rows on sturdy legs, chattering in the peculiar language of 2-year-olds while he chased butterflies and examined interesting rocks. His dark hair caught the morning sun, and his eyes, so much like his father's, sparkled with the curiosity and confidence of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. Mama, look! James held up a smooth pebble as if it were the rarest treasure. Beautiful, sweetheart, Abigail said, accepting the stone with appropriate reverence. Should we save it for Papa? Papa! James clapped his hands and looked toward the barn where Thaddeus was working on some project that involved a great deal of hammering and occasional mild profanity. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Abigail's attention to the mountain road. Dr. Morrison was riding up the path, his medical bag secured behind his saddle and his weathered face creased with what looked like excitement. "Mrs. Calloway," he called as he dismounted, "I have news." "Good news, I hope?" Abigail wiped her hands on her apron and scooped up James, who immediately began trying to grab the doctor's hat. "The best kind. Got a letter from Helena yesterday. Seems our friend Mr. Whitmore has been sentenced to 2 years in territorial. In prison for fraud and conspiracy. Marshal Sullivan built quite a case against him and his associates." Abigail felt a complex mix of emotions at the news. Relief, certainly, and a sense of justice served, but also a lingering sadness for the waste of a life that could have been different. 2 years seems harsh, she said finally. Not harsh enough, if you ask me. "Men tried to steal your home and break up your family." Dr. Morrison's expression softened slightly, though I suppose Christian charity would suggest we hope prison teaches him some humility. I hope it teaches him that some things can't be. "Abort," Abigail said quietly. After the doctor left, she found Thaddeus in his workshop, sanding what appeared to be the pieces of another rocking chair. The original one still graced their front porch, weathered now from mountain seasons, but still solid and beautiful. "Planning to expand our furniture?" she asked, settling James on a pile of wood shavings where he immediately began building elaborate castles. "Thought you might like one for the nursery," Thaddeus said without looking up from his work. "For when the next baby comes." Heat crept up Abigail's neck. They'd been trying for a second child, and she hoped that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. But she hadn't said anything yet, wanting to be certain before raising hopes that might be dashed. "What makes you think there's going to be another baby?" He looked up at her with that gentle smile that still made her heart flutter. "The way you've been avoiding coffee again, the way you fell asleep during supper yesterday, the way you keep on touching your belly when you think I'm not watching." She laughed, caught in her attempted secrecy. "When did you become so observant?" "When I married a woman worth paying attention to." He set down his sandpaper and reached for her, pulling her close despite James's protests about interrupted castle construction. "How long have you known?" "About a month. I wanted to be sure before." She gestured helplessly, still sometimes amazed that her body had proven the Boston doctors wrong, not once, but twice. "Before what? Before you let yourself believe in miracles again?" "Something like that." He kissed her forehead, then her nose, then her lips with the tenderness that had won her heart completely. "When?" "Early winter. If my calculations are right. Just in time for Christmas. Perfect timing. James will be old enough to help with his little brother or sister." They stood there in the golden afternoon light, James playing at their feet and another child growing safe beneath Abigail's heart, and she marveled at the completeness of her happiness. 5 years ago, she'd been a discarded woman with no prospects and little hope. Now, she was surrounded by more love than she'd ever dreamed possible. That evening, as they sat on the front porch in the rocking chairs, his original one and the one he'd finished just the day before, Abigail opened the family Bible to record the coming baby's expected arrival. The book was thick with entries. Now, their wedding date, James's birth, the births of several foals and calves that had become part of their mountain family. "What should we name this one?" she asked, her hand resting on the subtle swell that would soon be obvious to everyone. "If it's a girl, I'd like to name her Margaret after your mother." The suggestion made her eyes mist with grateful tears. "She would have loved that. She would have loved you. And if it's a boy, Thomas, perhaps. After your middle name? Thomas Calloway." He tested the sound of it. "I like that." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they talked about the future they were building together. More children, perhaps. Certainly more improvements to the homestead. James's education, which would probably involve boarding school in Helena eventually, though that day seemed impossibly distant. "Do you ever regret it?" Thaddeus asked suddenly. "Choosing this life over what Charles could have given you?" Abigail looked around at their mountain valley, now green with spring growth and alive with the sounds of wind in the pines and water. Running in the creek, she thought of her pressed flower collection, now filling several volumes and representing years of beauty discovered in wild places. She thought of the garden she'd planted with her own hands, the preserves she'd made from their own fruit, the bread she baked in the oven Thaddeus had built for her. Most of all, she thought of the love that surrounded her, strong and steady, and freely given, not contingent on her ability to bear children or her fitness for polite society, but rooted in respect and partnership and the deep contentment that came from building something together. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Even when the winters are long and the isolation gets to you, even then. Because I'd rather be isolated with you than surrounded by people in a place where I don't belong." James had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from a day of important toddler business. She rocked gently in the chair Thaddeus had made. For her, feeling the new baby flutter like a butterfly beneath her heart. Besides, she added softly, how can I regret the choice that gave me everything I ever really wanted? As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Abigail Turner Calloway closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of home. Her husband's quiet breathing, their son's contented sighs, the wind singing through the mountains that had become her sanctuary. Tomorrow there would be work to do, challenges to face, a life to build one day at a time. But tonight there was only peace and love and the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. In the distance, a mountain bird called to its mate, and the sound carried across the valley like a promise that some things, the best things, were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth choosing over and over again for all the days of a well-lived life.